Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Stray Pixels podcast, not currently sponsored by BetterHelp, which is a shame because, Bailey, this is an intervention.
Oh no.
It's just gotten too far. We need you to examine your use of the word monk and W. It's affecting your friends and family.
Yeah, man. I walked into a chat room last night and all I heard from Bailey was Monka W. Monka.
I'm your host. I'm Noisy Pixel staff writer Colin Buchanan, and I'm joined as usual by my co-staff writer Nathan Mejia and our editor-in-chief Bailey C. Mangle.
Heyo.
How are you guys doing this week?
Well, it's been a rough week. I'm not gonna lie. BetterHelp counseling would help. Trying to fish for that sponsor.
One day, Nathan.
One day.
Bailey, how about you?
Bailey?
I know, going through some stuff, but we'll get through it.
I think we all are.
Yeah.
So it's kind of important that we get some distraction from it, but unfortunately that distraction didn't really come in the form of like big gaming news this week.
We got Elden Ring calling.
Well, Elden Ring was last week.
Oh, was it?
It's been a whole week. We've had a whole week with GOTY
okay.
Elden Ring.
Bailey, are you
but I don't know that any of us are like quite so far into it that we can have like an engaged discussion about it.
I fucking plotted it, Colin. I don't know what you're talking about.
Sure you did.
Yeah, Bailey is coming in like no maidens.
No maidens?
So this week, usually we do our best to like try and find some topic that corresponds to something that happened in the past week. But this week we had a lot of smaller news and a lot of stuff that was like adjacent to us, but not really in our beat. So we could talk about the dissolution of Funimation, but that anime is not really on our beat at the moment. So that would feel kind of off topic. And I don't know how much we all specifically have to say about it. We could talk about Babylon's Fall, but honestly, at this point, Square Enix sales disappointments have been covered ground. We all know, we've all heard all the jokes.
Our topic should have been, is Babylon worse than Balin?
but you're the only one of us that's played it.
I could have done a fucking solo episode.
Solo episode. I'm so sure that you could.
I could have just talked about fucking Balin, how great that game is.
Yeah.
So what we decided to do this week was an idea that we've kind of had in the tank for a minute, which is the three of us are all people that have been playing games basically since we were little kids. And we come with that like just a wealth of knowledge about a ton of different franchises stretching back really far into the 90s and potentially beyond. And the one topical subject that I did kind of get inspired by this week was the release of the Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster on Steam. And that's the last one in the series, obviously, because Final Fantasy VII isn't a pixel game.
They can do it, man.
With the complete set now available, I felt like now might be the time to look back at some of the older Final Fantasy titles now that they're all recently available again, and start kind of a retrospective on some of these older games and what they meant to us now as we were growing up, because I think that we all have pretty interesting and differing perspectives on it. So this week we are starting with Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. Obviously, all three of which were very recently re-released on the Pixel Remaster series. But obviously, these were games that were kind of screwed as they were coming out because 2 did not initially come here. We got the first game, and then we got Final Fantasy 4, branded as Final Fantasy 2. Y'all have heard this story. And then Final Fantasy 6, branded as Final Fantasy 3. So, no, we're talking about like the actual Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3.
Final Fantasy the Lost levels.
Guilt battle systems and all, baby.
Let's go.
Prepare to hit yourself and heal yourself repeatedly for those XP points.
So when I was actually growing up, when the games were coming out, I wasn't quite old enough to play them yet. My first experience with any of these games was with this little guy right here. See if I can get the camera to focus on it. This is the Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls GBA port. That was released when they were still doing the Final Fantasy Advanced series, so they re-released 4, 5, and 6 onto the console as well. And then this actually came with 2 brand new post-game scenarios, one for each game. And the Final Fantasy 2 one was actually an extension of the story, which was kind of neat, as all the dead characters climbed out of hell is basically the plot. But I'm curious, what inspired each of you to play Final Fantasy 1, the very first game in the series?
I'll start because I have like the longest history with Final Fantasy. So as a kid, I obviously did the same as you. I also did not grow up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. My earliest memories is of 7 in like 1999 to 2000.
Normie.
Yeah. I skipped 8, went to 9, which 9 was my favorite. No matter how many times I went through, I Want to Be Your Canary.
Yeah, it's a good segment.
It's a good segment. But kind of realizing that I played, at that point, I was in college. So I was 21, 22. I played 7, 8, 9, 10, 10, 2, 11, a little bit of 11, 12. And at that point, I think 13 was the newest one when 14 was coming out. So I was like, it was, 14 was coming out or was in that middle ground of, we're screwed, so we're going to wait for the re-release. And I just kind of hit me like, I've never played 1 through 6. I should get on that. I started with those GBA ports for 1 and 2, and then went to the DS for 3. Because that was what we had.
Yep. That was the first time that Final Fantasy 3 came to the United States.
Yes. So that was my experience with them. And my experience definitely with 1 was actually pretty favorable. It wasn't too esoteric and like, oh, I don't know where to go now. But it wasn't so handholdy that I was like, oh, I'm bored now. It was a fine line between Nep and
my God.
Dark Souls.
Nep and Dark Souls. That's
oh my God. Bailey, how about you?
Oh my God. So I played, so the first FF I played was 10 and I was like 11. And then I played 4. But then like I got the PSP versions of 1 and 2.
Sure.
And I actually really enjoyed 1. I use a guide because I'm a bad gamer, but but 1 felt like, so at the time I also played Dragon Quest 1 like at the same time. And comparing the two, like I found 1 to, well, so I found FF1 to be like a far more ambitious game.
It's a lot, it's absolutely a lot more involved than Dragon Quest 1.
And I don't know, I actually really like the simple progression of 1, but there's a lot more freedom than I was expecting from that game. 2 I don't think is good.
We'll talk about it.
And 3 I'm kind of mixed on, but I kind of like it.
That's fair.
So Final Fantasy 1 has been 1 and 2 have been ported about a bajillion times. Just going down. So it originally came out in Japan in 1987, December 1987. Came here for the Nintendo Entertainment System in July of 1990. So 3 years later, you can see how far behind they already were, which is why the rebranding of a bunch of the later games in the series happened. Then it came out on the MSX2 and the Wonder Swan Color, both Japan only, obviously.
Wonder
Swan?
Was released as part of the Final Fantasy Origins collection on PS1 in 2002.
Yo, the 3-minute load times?
Which didn't come to North America until 2003 after the PS2 had already come.
That's pretty monkey.
Then released for the Game Boy Advance, obviously. Re-released for a couple of web-based platforms. Re-released for the PSP. And if you've never seen Final Fantasy 1 and 2 on PSP, they are gorgeous. They're very nice looking.
I think they're the best versions of the game, honestly.
Yeah.
And then they got the mobile ports for iOS, Android, and Windows Phone in
Windows
2010,
OS.
2011, and 2012 respectively. Got a Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console release in 2015, and then finally we got it as part of the Pixel Remaster last year.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy 1 is kind of a beast to look at now in comparison to basically every game in the series that follows it. I would describe it as a very opaque kind of game. It's not great at leading you where you need to go. Like, it's not hard to figure it out with trial and error, but you're also
the map's pretty small. It's not that hard to figure out.
Yeah, but it's also somewhat likely that you're going to wander in completely the wrong direction and get hit by a random encounter that's like 30 levels higher than you. Get completely wiped.
I mean, it's not like as bad as in 2 when you head up north to the frost giants.
And kind of a notable thing about Final Fantasy 1 is its legacy, specifically in all of the different Final Fantasy games that have been made to tie into it. So the most obvious ones are the upcoming Stranger of Paradise, which is supposedly Garland's origin story.
He's from Quadratum.
He's gonna do things his way.
He's
his way or the highway.
The driver for
He's the general manager of the Quadratum Old Navy, which is why he's dressed like that by default. But also the Dissidia games are really heavily implied to take place in an alternate universe version of the world from the first game. And Mobius Final Fantasy was pretty explicitly meant to be like an alternate universe prequel, like that kind of tells the story of how the Warriors of Light came to be in the first place, because none of them have like established characters or backstories or personalities. And this is the only game in the series that to this day still is primarily associated with that, because 3 kind of had something similar going on where all the characters were just the 4 Warriors of Light, and they were, that's why they get represented by Onion Knight. But the 3DS port gave them all specific characters and personalities. Final Fantasy 1, no, you have 4 totally generic nameless people that you get to arrange however you want to. And that was kind of interesting at the time, and to this day it's inspired a whole bunch of different challenges associated with the game. Obviously there's the big one of getting through the game with 4 white mages, which is very difficult because they can only use Dia for damage for quite a long time.
Man, that S&T language there.
Sure, it was but it's also like the legacy of it inspired elements of a whole bunch of different games too. So like for example, White Mages in Final Fantasy 14, a lot of their kit is really heavily inspired by the Final Fantasy 1 White Mage. And it was also rudimentarily the beginnings of what we now know as the job system. You couldn't change from one job to another, but you could advance Fire Emblem style into an advanced version of the job that you started as. And you had a list of 6 to pick from at the very beginning. They were warrior, monk, thief, red mage, white mage, black mage, if I remember correctly.
That
sounds right.
And it's kind of interesting to see like how many options the player was given in this extremely dated, otherwise NES title that didn't even have the programming in it to auto assign a new target if you chose to attack someone and then they died before that character's turn came up.
It was supposed to be Square's final fantasy column.
No, debunked. That is a myth. That is not actually true. That was the story for a very long time. There was actually like game trailers retrospective on Final Fantasy that they did a million years ago that I've watched a million times. And I remember that was the first place that I heard that, but it is not true. It was specifically called that for the alliteration because it sounded cool in English.
I don't know, man. What about the spirits within?
We do not discuss such matters.
So when's our episode about that movie?
I don't know, Bailey. Have you seen that movie?
I have.
I'm sure
actually.
I'm sure you've platted the viewing experience
Yeah,
for Final
I had to
Fantasy:
plat
The
it.
Spirits Within.
We'll talk about Spirits Within when we talk about Life is Strange.
Oh my gosh. It's gonna be a controversial episode.
Yeah, man.
So, how was your guys' experience actually playing through it the first time?
You go ahead, Bailey.
I actually found one pretty easy for the most part. Like, well, I like had a guide, so of course, but like,
well, sure, and you were playing like a pretty optimal version of it.
Yeah, like that PSP. Yeah. So like, I've played the PSP, and I've played the PS1 version. that like PS1 version is like really bad. Don't like play that.
No, it's terrible. The loading is awful.
It's really bad. But like when I use the guy, like there were like definitely some like times where I wouldn't have known where to go, but it's kind of like that is like definitely like purposeful with how the design was back in the day. Mm-hmm. But in terms of like the combat, like it's like very like they kind of had to account for what like variance you would have in your job setups, so they kind of made the fights not really like that like there's some that could be hard, but like they're like pretty like approachable no matter how you tackle them. You just have to like grind. Like it's like very like simple, bare bones like type of fighting,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then how about you?
It's pretty similar to Bailey. Of course, I had the brain power of a college student, so but I also noted that they had to do that, I think, so that way you couldn't accidentally mess something up by going like, oh, I went 2 months, a black mage and a warrior or something like that.
Yeah.
Where you don't actually mess yourself up. And even going further than that, I found that just the exploration in general felt a little more robust, especially considering future Final Fantasies after that, where it kind of just game design in general after that took a little like, hey, let's go over here now. Let's go over here. I've heard game design for more modern games starting with around 2000s be kind of like a theme park, where it's still fun, you're still having fun, but there's no really self-discovery. It's, hey, look at this, hey, look at that, let's go here.
Sure, yeah, right. It's designed to take you from one location to the next, and it's much more on rails than the original game is.
Yeah.
It's also kind of noteworthy that, like, so I mentioned you pick your 4 jobs at the beginning, you can't change them afterwards, and people now turn that into different challenges. But it's kind of interesting to note that would make this, very technically speaking, one of the first games that kind of let you adjust your own difficulty, because like you could make your party as optimal or as suboptimal as you wanted to. The game would not stop you. So it's kind of unique for the way that it would let you just decide to make the game exponentially more difficult right at the beginning. It would be like, sure, play with exactly what party you want to. It doesn't matter if this D&D party would wipe in the first session.
yeah. And also very, very fun about one in particular is that it's the first one that really encouraged you is, hey, no, this is you and your group of friends. You can name your guys Nathan, Colin, Bailey, and then Ryuji. And
you could project people onto them.
Yeah. Yeah, not Azario. Never Azario. He'd be the black mage screaming about all these nerds and how he doesn't want to do it.
No, Azario.
Oh my God. So that kind of was like a game where you were meant to like feel like you were journeying with a party of like you could insert your friends into it if you wanted to. A lot of other games kind of took inspiration from that. There's plenty of modern day games that don't really assign personalities to the characters that you create. You can just make them whoever you want them to be. And so like you now have the legacy of like Twitch streamers naming characters in Darkest Dungeon after their subscribers, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of like a little butterfly effect that kind of started here. Like there were other games that did it, but this was, I think, one of the first really notable ones. But that you could rename the characters in 2 but the characters in 2 were at least somewhat more rigid in personality.
The Wild Rose, Colin.
The Wild Roses.
The Wild Rose.
You gotta defeat the Emperor.
So Final Fantasy 2 kind of starts with what the NES equivalent of a video game dick swing. So you and your family are escaping the city that you grew up in as the Empire invades, and you're attacked by 4 horsemen who annihilate the shit out of you in an unwinnable fight where they will do like almost max damage every turn.
Xenoblade?
Yeah, man.
And then you wake up and in the rebel hideout, and your friend Maria's brother that was with you at the beginning is missing. And that's how Final Fantasy 2 starts. Like, in comparison to the first game, like very much having almost not a story at all. Like the only real story to be found in Final Fantasy 1 is the really vague find the 4 crystals and go fight chaos, and then there's time travel added at the very ass end of the game.
Stranger Paradise.
But you know, it is a much more bare bones fantasy story. Final Fantasy 2 is Star Wars.
Fantasy 2.
There's a lot more plot happening. The characters initially in the first release of the game weren't the most individualized, but I think that as time has gone on and we've seen Firion, Guy, and Maria and Leon like iterated upon and retranslated, they've kind of gotten to have more personality than they used to. But there was a lot of plot happening around them and a lot of people dying. Enough so that, like I said, the post-game story of Final Fantasy 2 is about all of your dead temporary party members climbing out of hell.
That's kind of like fucking badass. Actually.
It's metal.
Yeah. I want to say, that's an album by itself.
That's fucking Dragon Ball GT shit.
Proto Men, get on it.
Coming up on Dragon Ball Z.
Oh boy. So Final Fantasy 2 is most known today for the leveling system. So does one of you guys want to give a brief summary of how leveling in this game works?
All right, I can do that because I unabashedly love this system. As stupid and broken as it is, I love it. So it takes the RPG element of you do stuff to get better at stuff. Makes
Oblivion,
sense.
The Oblivion method.
Yes, you heal to up your healing magic. Damage people to do damage magic. Attack with your sword to upgrade your attack damage. Get hit to upgrade your health. Now, gentle viewers, I know what you're thinking. If I get hit and attack thing, why don't I just hit myself then heal myself? And yes, that's what you would do.
That is what you do.
So fucking stupid.
So what do you mean? It was so fun.
The thing about leveling in Final Fantasy 2 is every single individual stat and spell all levels separately.
Yep.
Which ends up creating an experience where you kind of have to do a lot of grinding, and you have to grind in a way that without the context of how it works makes no fucking sense, because you should be hitting your other party members to have them take HP damage and have them more rapid, because you'll be hitting them harder than the enemies that you're fighting will be hitting them. So it makes the most sense to run back to the starting area, get into an encounter, kill all but one goblin, and then just have your party members start wailing on each other. But if you engage with it on the face of it, here's my hot take, is it's kind of a paradise if you actually like grinding. Because every individual thing you can grind for, and it will become very slowly better. Do I recommend using cheats if possible to speed up the process of grinding your spells? Yes, because grinding spells is a nightmare, and by the time you get a spell to like really anything approaching like a decent tier, you'll have one to replace it. But like, if you're looking for a game that you can sink a lot of time into, this is kind of it, especially if you're very limited on, what games you can play, as we were as children in the early 2000s.
The so I kind of so like whenever I think about FF2, like I always think about Dissidia first because I think about Furion in that game. And the Emperor. And I'm like, I kind of unironically like Furion because of of that.
Yeah, sure. Like these are some of the characters that benefited really greatly from games like Dissidia Opera Omnia, where like you can have whole subplots featuring them, and they're like much more well written. They have personalities that are distinguishable from each other. And like they're still a little bit generic, but at the same time they've got like a charm to them from knowing like, hey, these are like OG NES like RPG characters, and this is like sort of their first steps into what was to come in terms of narrative writing for these games. Because like nowadays, like when you think of individual Final Fantasy games, anything after 3, the first thing you will probably think of is the characters that were in the games. And so having that kind of like have its roots here, even though it wouldn't quite take root for another 2 games, does make this one a little bit more important than even the first game in terms of what it set up. It also sets up chocobos, which obviously are like a huge mascot for the series. This was the game where we codified Sid. Sid appeared as a background character, really not even a background character. He didn't appear at all. He was a lore character in the first game, Sid of the Lufane. And this character does actually appear in Dissidia Duodecim, but we got our first actual Sid in Final Fantasy II. So a lot of what we now know as elements of Final Fantasy actually started here as opposed to the first game.
What if they make like a second Stranger of like Paradise and it's about an FF2 prequel?
You know what? Honestly, I would totally play Stranger of Paradise and it was a side story from Leon's perspective.
That'd be some wild shit, yo.
I would totally be down for that, because like you can't really do one about the Emperor. The Emperor is not, a big sword boy. But I honestly think that there's a lot of characters in Final Fantasy II that could be pretty dramatically expanded upon.
It's like an untapped well. I don't think they have the courage to try.
Well, so Opera Omnia actually just recently added Layla, who was one of the party members, the temporary party members that dies into, and there's a whole bunch of other ones that people actually remember. There's Ricard, who was the first Dragoon in the series. There's Minwu, who was a extremely overcompetent white mage for the brief time that you get to have him in your party. He's much better than any of the other party members that you have by that point. There's Yosef, who gives you a boat, and that is his contribution to the plot.
Buggers.
But there's a lot of characters, and I think that especially given the popularity of the Dragoon characters in all the later games, I think that Ricard has a lot of potential as like someone that could be expanded upon in other media.
It's funny because when people think of Dragoons, they usually go to like Cain
is the first step, because he's the codification. Like Ricard was a character who had his own stuff going on in 2, but Cain was the first time that someone with this sort of character type, the dark and the brooding Dragoon, was like actually a main element of the plot, as opposed to a friend that you meet along the way.
The fucking cup cane, man. You hate to see it.
So, Bailey, what are your thoughts on Final Fantasy II? Because you're talking to 2 people who clearly liked it.
My favorite Final Fantasy game?
I don't believe you.
And I've sunk over 200 hours into FF2, Colin. I've platted the PS1 version.
Oh yeah, I believe it.
Oh sure. Bailey's so good at trophies that he was getting trophies 10 years before they existed.
Yeah, I made my own list. And like
he was getting trophies.
Don't at me. I know that number's not right.
I don't know. So like, I kind of like the idea of the stat system in 2. I just think it's way too far.
Yeah,
Like,
it does go a little far, and I've
Yeah.
seen plenty of other games use like identical systems and do much better with it because
Yeah.
they had the forethought to make sure that like it worked in a way that made more sense.
I kind of appreciate it in that way. Like it's a really like novel concept for a sequel to do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Especially after how simple one was. But like I think if it wasn't, I think it was just maybe like the base stats or something, like just like not as extensive as it was, it'd be a lot more approachable than how it
Sure.
ended up being.
But that's another one where I think that there's like kind of a butterfly effect because now you have things like effort values in Pokemon that work almost the same way. And that's been a mechanic in the series for a long, long, long time. Like it's a hidden one, but it's there. We all know it's there.
Also, I do encourage you to hear the PSP soundtrack because it's like really good.
So good.
It's
The music
really
in Final
good.
Fantasy II is underrated as hell.
It's a really good soundtrack.
Every time it comes up in Opera Omni, I'm like, oh my god, I forgot how much I like the soundtrack in this game. There's a lot to really dislike about 2 nowadays. It's very punishing in comparison to the first game. The dungeon design is pretty universally bad. Final Fantasy II is memed for basically every single dungeon having hallways with a bunch of doors at the end, and one of the doors has a treasure chest, and the other 3 doors all lead to an empty room that they drop you in the middle of with an intensely high encounter rate. And it's just trial and error. It's not fun. But I mean, I developed an appreciation for it even when I was little. It's got like a certain kind of charm to it if you can get over how extremely dated and punishing it is. Truly the Dark Souls of Final Fantasy games, except now we have a Dark Souls of Final Fantasy games.
That's a featured piece they're calling the first Dark Souls of Final Fantasy.
No, Azario would murder me.
Yo, it gets some clicks, man. We gotta.
The last time I directly compared something to Dark Souls, and it literally was a Soulsborne game.
Look, all right, we gotta be brave with the headlines, Colin.
I gotta push it. I gotta push my luck.
Gotta push those boundaries. Gotta get me pictures of Spider-Man first and foremost.
Zario be like, get me screenshots of Spider-Man.
Oh my god, I can't. Azario would be like the perfect role for that. Oh my god.
I can imagine him like just laughing. He goes, "You serious?
You serious?"
No, he'd be like, "You serious?"
I think we know the thumbnail for today's episode.
Oh my gosh.
We gotta like Photoshop his face onto him.
We'll get Ryuji on it. We'll get him on it.
Before we move on, because we got to take a break. Nate, do you have any closing thoughts on Final Fantasy 1 or 2?
I think anybody who's curious about going back should 100% do it. I think the Pixel remasters are probably the cheapest way to do it. But it's nice to see kind of where a lot of this started and how different Final Fantasy 1 and 2 are, because I believe 2 is a direct response to 1 being so popular and them wanting to break out of the mold completely from it.
I should also know that the PSP versions have more content. So if you want to get those
the PSP versions, the Game Boy Advance version, I looked, it goes for about 30, which isn't great. But it was also not an extremely wide release, so it's not terrible, all things considered. And it does have the extra content, the extra stories, and the music mode in the bestiary that they put in all the other advanced ports. The advanced ports are actually the most feature complete versions of really any of these games, except for maybe 4. And obviously 3 was never released on GBA, but yeah, that would be if you are willing to invest and you still have, a GBA or a GameCube with a Game Boy player lying around, these are the versions that I recommend. Bailey, how about you? Any closing thoughts?
I think it's definitely worth at least playing FF2 because it's kind of like I think every mainline game has its own kind of strengths that are worth acknowledging in hindsight. And 2, I think, is really kind of like, even though I don't like playing it, I think it's probably the most standout mechanically of the first 6 games.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right, so we are going to take a quick ad break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the lost Final Fantasy game for a very long time, and how each of us got to play it for the very first time. So we will see you guys in a minute.
Bye.
Bye.
Welcome back, everybody. So in the second half of today's episode, we are going to be looking specifically at Final Fantasy III, which is a game with a fascinating history and legacy, because like 2, this was a game that codified a lot of different things that we would see in future Final Fantasy titles, but also was kind of sort of lost media for everyone outside of Japan for a very long time. So Final Fantasy III was initially released in 1990 in Japan and never was translated, never was published anywhere else. It actually skipped the Final Fantasy Origins release. I believe that was just covering
1, 2.
Yeah. And then we got another one that included 4 and 5. Or was it might have been 4, 5, and 6.
Well, no, I think I remember having that thing. I think it was 1 and 2 on one disc, and then 4 on another disc, I thought.
That does sound right. Actually, I remember it being multiple discs.
Yeah.
But the rest of the world did not get Final Fantasy III until it got a full 3D DS remake, not remaster, not port, a remake, in 2006. And this was kind of notable. This started something of a trend that everybody wanted to see Square continue, where we got basically complete like modernized reimaginings of the older Final Fantasy games, and a lot of people wanted to see this continue forward for 4, 5, and 6, but we only got 4. They had been promising that 5 would be possible on the 3DS, and then it never happened, and instead we got the really terrible original mobile ports of 5 and 6. But the Final Fantasy III remakes, as I mentioned before, were somewhat notable for being almost a little bit of an overwrite of the story, taking the 4 generic Warriors of Light that you played in the original version of the game and making them 4 actual character party members. You had Luneth, Ark, Ingus, and Refia. And they didn't see a whole lot of exposure outside of this port. This port this remake got ported to a whole bunch of different systems. It got put on Windows and PSP and mobile, I want to say. But
that was the version that got ported to mobile.
These versions of the characters actually don't really exist outside of the context of this remake. So in Dissidia, in Opera Omnia, you just see the Onion Knight. But the Onion Knight in Dissidia does have an alternate costume that makes him look like Luneth. So they did kind of sort of acknowledge the existence of this port. So did either of you guys have this remake growing up?
That's the
yes.
That's the only that and the Pixel one are the
only versions of the game that ever made it outside of Japan.
Yeah. The DS one first. Pretty good game. Well, I don't know. It's like I really like so that was the first game I played that ever had a job system. And it was like really eye opening to me at the time, but in hindsight I probably wouldn't enjoy it as much now. Because there's been so many like better interpretation. Sure. Of the job system now. Like I assume I'm gonna really love 5 when I play that.
5 is the big one. 5 is honestly probably the last one in the whole series that has quite so thoroughly embraced the changing jobs. The only exception I can think of is 13.
There's also a 10 too.
10-2 is a pretty good example, but like I'm talking about like the mainline series in terms of like how each one changes, because obviously Final Fantasy nowadays is known for basically totally reinventing the wheel every new game. But Nate, how about you? Did you get to play this when you were younger?
Well, yeah, when I was younger, I had to look up the release date. Like, when does this come out? You know, and it came out 2006. I was a freshman in high school. Yeah, I definitely picked it up on release. Maybe not on release because it actually released a week before my birthday.
I got it for Christmas.
Yeah.
Oh.
So it might have been one of the games I sat around and be like, oh, I want this game for my birthday. But yeah, I grew up with the DS remakes. I didn't actually beat them though till I think I was in college going through that marathon within 2 to 3 months of just playing nothing but Final Fantasy, because I was like kind of dumb as a high schooler.
Who among us wasn't?
Yeah.
Yo, Among Us?
Yeah, Among Us. Yes.
Dear Lord.
But yeah, no, I was just kind of dumb, and I couldn't really get the hang of it. And I thought, and back then I was really paralyzed by choice on some certain stuff, like, oh, what's optimal thing. I didn't learn till later to just not care and play however I want to play.
Wow.
Yeah, I absolutely feel that.
Yeah. You know, and I still feel like a lot of people get too hung up on optimal and not enjoying the game.
That's like a whole topic we could talk about, honestly.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
like that's
sure.
one of the ways that I ended up I've played a lot. I've mentioned before, I played a lot of the Telltale adventure games, and like the only way that I've really made it through them is by like reminding myself the game's not gonna like punish you that badly if you make like bad decisions. You're gonna make it to the end regardless. And in 3, like you might have extra grinding to do if you set up your party poorly, but unlike 1, like you can actually fix it.
3's a lot more generous than
yes.
1 and 2.
So for those who may not have played it, so Final Fantasy 1, you pick your 4 characters' jobs at the beginning of the game, and like I said, you cannot change them. You can improve them. You can class up the way that you would in Fire Emblem, but you can't change them. Final Fantasy 3 gives you the option to change them basically whenever you want to. Everybody starts in the original version of the game as the Onion Knight class, which is very basic. Really, all it can do is attack, use extremely simple magic, and use items. But as each character masters other jobs, the Onion Knight class and the Freelancer in the DS remake gets additional abilities. So it kind of is a class that gets better as you master other classes, and then you unlock more individual jobs as you go through the story. Every time you get to a certain point in the story, you unlock a whole new set of jobs, and you can keep changing them as much as you want to. It's a little bit suboptimal to change them really super often, but there are also points in the game that you can't get through without having specific jobs. One of the big ones is there are areas of the game that you need the mini spell for in order to get through, so you have to have a party member that can use it. But there's bosses that are extremely difficult to kill with really any party other than what the game intends you to have. So it's still kind of rigid, but it introduces a lot more a lot more, I don't want to say deliberate, constructed freedom, I'll say, as opposed to Final Fantasy 2, where every individual character, you can make them do whatever you want to, but it's a lot less easy to build someone a specific way and still have them like be useful, as opposed to Final Fantasy 3, where you can just pick a thing that you want someone to do and they'll just naturally get better at it as you keep grinding.
Funny enough, thinking about Final Fantasy 3, not to kind of derail us too much, but I can see that DS remake inspired a lot for eventually Bravely Default.
Oh my god, yes.
Like, that's like why I'm so thankful to the remake of 3.
There's like a pretty direct line from the Final Fantasy 3 and 4 remakes to Final Fantasy the four Heroes of Light, I want to say it was called, to Bravely Default. So the art style is kind of the biggest one, because the art style of this game is pretty directly just a lower poly version of what we have for Bravely Default, Bravely Second, Bravely Default 2. And jury's out on how much you really like that. I think that by Bravely Default 2, it doesn't look as good anymore on the bigger Switch screen, but it honestly looks pretty phenomenal for a DS game. Because apart from like Mario 64 DS, we hadn't really seen like full scale like huge company efforts to make a game specifically for the 3DS that looks like it could be like a PS1 or an N64 game, even though the DS was obviously able to make that happen. We knew that before it even came out, because Mario 64 DS was one of the launch titles.
There was Kingdom Hearts Recoded, man. On 358/2.
I was gonna say Days came first. So Square Enix was absolutely one of the companies that was trying to make like full console experiences work on the DS. There were other companies that were like making first person shooters and other like 3D games, but they were games that very much could have only worked on the DS or were versions of console games that were downgraded, demade to be DS games. And this was like one of the first efforts that I saw to just make a full-scale DS game the way that you used to make a 6th generation title, and I think that was really cool.
Yeah, The World Ends With You is probably the best example of like a DS specific game.
Well, sure, but I mean like in terms of the graphical style, because the 3 and 4 remake, they honestly look a lot like Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
Is the one that I would compare them most to, because Final Fantasy VII, especially when you were out of combat, also had the very squished down sprite models, and these actually look better than the Final Fantasy VII field models. You can see a lot more of the details in them. But something to note about 3 is that 3 is also kind of difficult. This was so depending on which version you played, this is the last game in the series to use the D&D spell slot mechanic for magic, as opposed to just the MP pool that came in starting in 4. But it marks a pretty clear like dividing point of this is like a different kind of Final Fantasy that you have to learn to play a different way, because you can't use spells however you want to. And it's a lot more rigidly structured in, you can use this spell only this many times, and you can restore casts of this, but it won't restore casts like it won't restore you to be able to do whatever you want the way that the MP pool system worked. Do you guys have any like specific memories about this game, the DS remake, I mean, that sort of stuck with you? Because I just remember grinding before the first boss when you couldn't change your job yet. And before you get off of the floating island that you start on.
I'm trying to think, and it's kind of weird because I remember playing it, but I think at this point, Final Fantasy 3, despite me liking it, kind of out of 1, 2, and 3 was the least memorable for me.
I can understand that.
I'm actually the same way. Like like one just has the like one for how plain it is has the novelty of like being the first.
Yeah,
it was like pretty infamous.
Yeah,
and like you don't really hear people talk about 3.
Yeah,
like it's like kind of like 5, where it's like in this weird realm of like not really niche, but it's like just like not really regarded as like highly.
It's not well remembered. I think that a lot more people at this point, like you can look at the Onion Knight character as he's been used in other media. And he's got more of a personality than really any of the remade characters do. Especially like I'm going to keep coming back to Opera Omnia, because it's like a lot of what we've seen of these characters in recent times, but like the whole current plot of Dissidia Opera Omnia pretty heavily revolves around the Onion Knight character, and treats him as a character more than the actual game he comes from does. But it's not the most memorable plot wise, because it's kind of a meet in the middle between the first and the second game's approach to narrative. In terms of like the way that the world is designed, this was the first game that we really saw lean into having more than one overworld, which is something that you'd see more of in 4 and 5. But one of like the first twists of this game is the fact that the starting area is a floating island that's above a much larger overworld map that you go to basically at the end of the game's prologue. But it's also I would probably say the game with the most the most biblical imagery, because that used to be a thing in Final Fantasy games that was really heavily censored by Nintendo of America at first, where they would change all the churches. But like you literally start in the village of like that's about as biblical of a reference as you can get outside of the betrayer character in 4 being named Cain. But it's kind of weird that Final Fantasy 3 is kind of a vacuum. We don't like it was lost media, and it was a game that we all kind of wanted to see as a fandom outside of Japan, like before it came out, and then it came out, and it was impressive as a game in terms of the DS remake, but it doesn't leave a very big impression because you know what's coming next. And because of the return to not really having like super defined characters, like they try to rewrite them. The characters, by the way, of the Final Fantasy 3 DS remake were created by Yoshi P. If you didn't know that before.
You'll Colin's favorite man in the world.
My absolute hero. But the characters are still very much just kind of archetypes that don't really go through a lot of development. So it just creates a really unmemorable narrative. And I don't even want to say that it's like a really bad game, but it's not. Out of the first 3 games, I would say that it is the one that you kind of want to go back to the least.
Yeah. Which is funny that we labeled it as lost media for a long time, because it's the media, we most forgotten about now. And the thing I remember the most that you're like, oh, what's your recent memory of Final Fantasy 3? And I was like, Onion Knight.
Yeah. And Onion Knight wasn't in this version of the game. Onion Knight was a bonus job in the DS remake, but like as a character, he didn't exist in this game. So it's kind of stuck in this position where like the stuff that you would want to see out of it, and not, we know this now, we didn't especially know this before unless you played like a translated version of the game where you learn Japanese. But like if you're interested in Final Fantasy for the narrative, 2 has a better narrative. If you're interested in it for the characters, 4 has better characters. If you're interested in it for the job system, 5 has a dramatically improved version of this exact job system. So it's kind of stuck in the land of not being great at any one thing. So it kind of becomes unmemorable next to all of these other games that we already had access to by the time it finally got to us. It was probably a huge achievement at the time, but when it finally got to us, in 2006, we had so many better options. But it's kind of interesting to note that this is really the one game in the series that people probably have the least to say about, because you can think of really any other title in the entire series and probably be able to fill a 10-minute segment about it, just based on what even if you haven't played it. Like Final Fantasy 4, you have the beginnings of like the actual narrative with defined characters that all have defined roles in the story and defined roles in combat. Final Fantasy 5, you have the job system, you have the much goofier tone of the game compared to all the other ones, and you have the first death of a character in one of these games. And then 6 like is just kind of a culmination of basically every other game up to that point, where they invented or not invented, but like took a bunch of the jobs from 3 that hadn't been characterized yet, gave them characters, created this massive ensemble cast, and puts them in like an epic story with personal consequences, and takes out like even the concept of a protagonist. But 3, I mean, it has the first job system. That's kind of it.
Of the first 6 final, so like I think it's fair to assume, like, to say that 3 has the hottest final boss.
The Cloud of Darkness.
Yeah.
Yeah, bro.
When I do write the waifu list for Final Fantasy,
boy.
she's gonna be pretty high up there.
Yeah.
But like the thing with Cloud of Darkness is it's barely in the game.
And that makes it more appealing, man.
It's barely in there.
The fucking mystery.
And Cloud of Darkness is more of an idea in the game itself. It's not even a character.
It's a concept.
It's an idea.
That's why I'm not giving it a gender, is because it looks like a sexy floating lady with crazy white Medusa hair. But it's a and the funny thing is that depending on your interpretation, so the notable thing about 3 nowadays is its direct inspiration of the very first raid series in Final Fantasy XIV, which is the Crystal Tower. And the final boss of the Crystal Tower is the Cloud of Darkness, and it is the same Cloud of Darkness from Final Fantasy III. It's not the character transplanted into another universe, because the Cloud of Darkness is a concept that exists across dimensions. So that's kind of neat. But also, if you've played that raid series, you've basically gotten all you really need to out of 3, especially since they took the Eureka like side concept from that final dungeon and put it into 14 in the Stormblood expansion as a thing everyone hated.
Yep.
And it's not great in the original either. Its only purpose is to grind for stuff for the final boss.
It's also not great when they redid it to the Battlefield or whatever it was called, the Bajan Resistance.
But it's kind of difficult to talk about this game because there's not a lot to say about it. And
in a lot of ways, it feels like a regression from 2, which is so weird because it has all this other stuff that would be consideration of progression of 1.
I do kind of wonder how 2 was received in Japan when it first came out. Because if there was a negative reaction, I could kind of see them trying to go back to how
I can find
maybe
a review from the time.
Yeah,
it's pretty. Yeah, I do kind of want to see how they thought about it. Because I feel like 3 in Japan would have been a far more positive hit than 2 when it came out.
Well, what's funny because it's actually reviewed pretty highly. Famitsu gave it a 35 out of 40 for the NES version.
But at the same time, Famitsu is pretty well known for giving perfect scores.
Yeah, they gave Sonic Forces a 30 something.
Yeah.
So the thing with, I don't know if you know this about Famitsu's review structure, and this is something for the audience as well. So Famitsu has 4 different people review every game and then adds up the points, what they gave it out of 10 to make their final score. It's a little overcomplicated, but I think to note about Famitsu is that they are much more likely to give games from a certain franchise really high scores. And obviously Final Fantasy hadn't quite been codified as a franchise yet, but they have kind of a history of giving very generous review scores to games. Because the way that you would convert that into one of our out of 10 review scores obviously is to take a thing and divide it by 4, and 35 divided by 4 is still, it's still kind of high, but it's not an 8. And that is kind of an interesting note for no, I'm wrong. I did math wrong.
35 divided by 4.
I did math wrong.
32.
Because that would be 8 point something.
Yeah, it would be 8 point something.
But the fact that it doesn't have a perfect score is kind of notable in and of itself, because a lot of Final Fantasy games that came afterwards did get perfect scores from them, even if they were kind of divisive elsewhere. So for 2, hang on, I'm looking reception.
I see. Yeah. Because Nintendo reviewed the fucking Wii Virtual Console version. They gave it a fucking 8, man.
Yeah, man, those are our top competitors.
But at the same time, you gotta wonder by the time it came here, Final Fantasy absolutely was a franchise that should get consideration. And like, you know, we one of the first things that I heard at Noisy Pixel was specifically do not weigh a game score just based on who made it or who published it or what series it's part of. And I don't know if quite everybody always gets the memo. But like you look at, you know, IGN is kind of memed for like the idea that they give out like far too high scores. They gave the PSP version a 6.1.
Yeah. The game's re-releases got considerably jacked through the mud. And I ever remember
Holy shit.
before I started 2 that I knew 2 was considered the worst Final Fantasy game.
Yeah.
So I'm on the Wikipedia page for 2.
Yeah.
The Famitsu gave the PlayStation version of 27. That's like
so. The thing about the Final Fantasy Origins, basically all of the ports of the NES and the Super Nintendo games for the PS1 is that they're optimized terribly. They run crap.
They're really bad.
And the loading times are egregious.
Yeah,
like
really
I'm talking like potentially 30 seconds for a random encounter.
Chrono Trigger is also a really bad one on there.
Yeah.
The only thing they even add is FMVs.
And even then you can see what I mean, because they gave a game that is that miserable of an experience to play, they still gave it a 27.
It's just like for Famitsu, you can tell that's pretty bad.
Yeah.
So I'm like, no shame to other reviewers. This is something that I've personally noticed every time that, you know, I've looked at a Famitsu score is I'm like, some of these seem kind of high. And like if someone genuinely engaged with it that much, obviously I have a lot of personal fondness for Final Fantasy 2, but at the same time I also admit it's not a very good game nowadays. It was revolutionary at the time. No other game was really doing something like this in that space, and we would see a lot more of it once Western RPGs started becoming really popular, because so many of them are really heavily based on Dungeons and Dragons, where a lot of the growth is very granular like that. But nowadays it is kind of hard to go back to without knowing what you're getting into, and it's strange to play one of these games and not be assigned a number of experience points at the end of a fight. So you got to know what you're getting into with these earlier games, and that's kind of an idiosyncrasy of the first 3 games, is that if you don't know going in what you're in for, they are really different experiences from basically anything that comes afterwards, because Final Fantasy IV and onward are very heavily story driven experiences that, again, they're theme park. They will take you from place to place to place. They will pretty clearly delineate what you are supposed to be doing, and a lot of the time how you are supposed to be doing it. And these games are very much not that. Particularly 1 and 2. But that also kind of gives them a lot more freedom than a lot of the later games have, and that's something that I think that the newer games have kind of started to reclaim. Especially after 13 was raked over the coals for how much of a theme park game it was, because, you know, it's extremely overtly linear, and they kind of took that back a little bit for 15 and tried to make it more of an adventure game the way that 1 and 3 were. So these games have a very broad legacy that extends beyond just the fact that there's more numbers that come after 1, 2, and 3. And I think that honestly, at this point, that's kind of all that we really need to take from them. That's kind of my take on these at this point, is that if you're not a completionist who specifically wants to go back to them, I think that they're not really essential anymore, unless you want an appreciation for how far the series has come.
Man, just wait till Stranger Paradise, man.
Yeah, man.
That's gonna be the that's gonna be the fucking new FF1.
Yeah, man, throw on your fucking jersey, get your shorts on, to put on Limp Biscuit, and keep on rolling, baby.
Keep on rolling.
If Square wanted to try and make a more cohesive version of the Final Fantasy 1 universe, I'd be on board for that. The problem is that no two of these like tie-in games make any fucking sense together. You can't put them together and have them work. Like Dissidia and Mobius are both technically prequels to Final Fantasy 1 at the same time.
They're just separate world lines, Colin.
But like this is a game that already has time travel in it. Like it's a little bit overly complicated, and I appreciate what they're going for because Final Fantasy 1's narrative is so open to expansion that I get taking that opportunity and mining it a little bit. But as for the actual game itself, unless you want to go out of your way to do it, which obviously it's super easy right now because you can just go buy all these games on Steam. I don't know that anybody specifically needs to come back to this trilogy.
That's fair.
Bailey, what are your serious thoughts on it that don't relate to Stranger of Paradise?
Stranger of Paradise, man, the new FF1. I think it's pretty much exactly as you said. Like, there's only really merit in coming back like to these if you're just a really big series fan, because they don't really like. I don't think you're gonna play one, maybe two. I don't know, but I don't think you're gonna play 1 or 3 and like really leave it feeling impacted by it. Like, there's a lot, like the combat of 1 is further refined. Like, the combat of 1 and 3 is just refined further, and the stories, they don't really mean anything. Like I guess, like, just from an appreciation standpoint, it's kind of cool, but I don't know, like I think the I think that's kind of why I like the Pixel remaster so much now, is like because they've made 1, 2, and 3 a lot more approachable, like kind of like how the PSP versions of 1 and 2 did. Like, they're like those are, I think, the best ways to play them, because they kind of lack the excess like baggage that, because like the extra content of like 1 and 2 on PSP was kind of not that great. And so like I think the best way to play them would be the Pixel ones. So if you want to play them, they're there. I think it's just great that they're just all made available.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that from a preservation standpoint. Nate, how about you?
I'm going to get from a little different angle. Of course, I think these are mandatory if you're a big fan of Final Fantasy, you're going to play them already, or if you're thing. But more so, I was a novice game designer at the time when I picked back up 1, 2, and 3. And coming back in that kind of thing, I think these are mandatory if you want to get into game design. To see what worked, what didn't work.
Well, sure. I think that a lot of older games can be really educational in terms of like working within limitations, because obviously you really had only so much that you could possibly do going back to the Famicom and the NES days, and even further back potentially, like looking at the ingenuity of what they managed to accomplish and the way that they did it when the hardware was so constraining can be really inspiring for people that are looking at game design now. And that's one of the reasons why you see so many indie developers popping up and being like, I want to make retro style RPGs the way that they used to make them when I was a kid. But if you are just a regular person, I don't want to say a regular gamer because not all of us need to use that label.
Gamer.
Gamers.
But if you're just a regular person that's not like getting into the industry, I think that if you're curious about the way that these games really feel to play, the game that I would play is Dragon Quest XI. Dragon Quest XI is very much a modern reinterpretation of the way that these games feel to play, because that's kind of what Dragon Quest has continued to be in the interim as Final Fantasy has evolved and gone in a million different directions. Dragon Quest is an old school RPG. They keep making new ones, but it still feels like playing you know, an NES game or a Super Nintendo game in terms of like the way that the game actually functions. But I think that there's just a lot more memorable content and just a lot more going for it in general, in terms of the casual gaming experience nowadays. If you're hardcore, go for it. Play Final Fantasy 2. It's hard as hell, unless you cheese it by attacking your party members over and over again. But I think that the next set are significantly more worth revisiting for many reasons. But in terms of if you are a fan of modern Final Fantasy and you want to see where it comes from, there are elements that started here, but really 4 is the one where modern Final Fantasy really starts. So that's my 2 cents.
Nate's favorite game.
Any closing thoughts?
Final Fantasy has been long and storied series. I can only see it getting better from where we're standing on now, and kind of looking back kind of reminds me that this game wasn't always perfect, and that we're just going through another growth spurt.
Bailey, how about you?
Oh, Fantasy, you know, it's just kind of cringe. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Stray Pixels podcast. We're thinking about calling this little sub-series Stray Memories.
Stray Memories.
But we don't know when the next one will be, but we post episodes of this show every Tuesday on your podcast app of choice and on the Noisy Pixel YouTube channel. What was your guys' experience with the first 3 Final Fantasy games? We want to hear from you. You can leave a comment under this video, or you can talk to us on Twitter. You can find me, Colin, at the Arcane Ranger. You can find Nate at Less Than Nathan, and you can find Bailey at Orpheus Joshua, or the site itself at Noisy Pixel News. The Stray Pixels podcast is brought to you by NoisyPixel.net. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers who work hard to bring you the latest news, reviews, previews, podcasts, and more. Please like, subscribe, and follow to keep up with our feature content, and we will see you guys next week.